The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
All right, welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're talking to Peter Golden from Guilderland. He has his third novel out. It's called Nothing is Forgotten. It is a Cold War thriller. And I just was telling Peter before we started, I got about 50 pages left. Everything is converging. You're really good at the slow reveal. So it's a very exciting book. It's actually really good. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, I wanted to ask you before we started, in your journalistic career, you wrote a book called O Powerful Western Star, American Jews, Russian Jews in the Final Battle of the Cold War. And for that book, you have quite a list of people that you interviewed. I'll read, former presidents Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Secretaries of State Kissinger, Alexander Haig, George Shultz, Lawrence Eagleburger, Israeli Prime Ministers Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Shamir, and you even interviewed Gorbachev.
3 times.
3 times. Okay, so you seem to have a fascination with the Cold War. So why don't we start there? Tell me about you and the Cold War, Peter. What's
Well, it's my life. I mean, that shaped the world that we're living in now, and it shaped my entire life, and it went on for a very long time.
Oh yeah, it was up to 79, right?
No, you'd say, I think, until the wall comes down, and was it at 89?
I'm sorry, 89.
89. Yeah, so it starts in 46. It starts right after the war. It starts before the end of the war. I mean, you can take the view that the first shot was really fired when Stalin went into Poland and executed all of these Polish military officers in Katyn Forest, because he didn't want any nationalists around at the end of the war. I mean, a lot of what went on in World War II was Stalin jockeying to control Eastern Europe. He would have been happy for the World War II to go on for another couple of years.
Okay. So you say in the acknowledgments of your book here that you've heard stories of the vanished members of my family. Now, tell me what that's about. Why did you choose to?
Because no one knows what happened to them. They're in Romania, they're in Russia, and I don't know where they are. No one knows where they are. And this is a story, this is not an uncommon story in the Holocaust. I remember interviewing a woman who her mother had 8 brothers and sisters. And they all went off their separate ways during the war, some to camps, some to the forests where they hid. And at the end of the war, there was one left.
And in your book, you have several situations like that where no one knows. But what I meant was...
Well, I'll tell you, this is interesting. When Eisenhower in 45 flew up to Russia, the Soviet Union, to see Zhukov, who was the head of their armed forces, Zhukov was beside himself, and he comes out to meet Eisenhower. And Eisenhower describes the scene. He sees nothing but rubble. And Zhukov says to him, first thing he says to him is, "We're not even going to be able to count the dead." That's what Zhukov said to him. And the truth is, for many years, they claimed that 20 million had died. They're up to 26 million now, and there are some historians that think it's probably past 30. And that's out of 60 million or so in the Second World War. So even with a conservative number, you're talking 35 to 40% of the people who died in World War II were Soviet citizens.
So one thing about your book, in Nothing is Forgotten, you contrast the United States, the book takes place in 1964 and 65, America in 64 and 65, which is kind of a post-Eisenhower sort of upbeat era, rock and roll and everything. And then when they go back to Germany and Russia and everything, it's still almost like it's post-war situation.
Well, sure, the war was fought there. I mean, the Soviet Union, they didn't have adequate housing. They didn't have, Germany was very organized, and they were good at fixing things up. But I interviewed people who worked in Germany in the mid-'60s. They were still clearing rubble away. I mean, it's hard to imagine. So when I talk to groups, I say, imagine the Twin Towers after 9/11, and imagine a whole country looks like that.
Yeah.
And that's what the Soviet Union looked like. I mean, here's another number I use. The Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. So the boys born in 1923, 17 and 18-year-old boys, those who had been born in 1923. At the end of the war, in May of 1945, 80% of those boys were dead. The destruction, the level of destruction is unimaginable.
I mean, even in England, you see clips from the mid to late 50s, it's still...
Right. Yeah, I mean, but that was limited compared to what the Germans did to the Soviet Union and to what the British, the Americans, and the Russians did to Germany. I mean, we leveled whole cities. We burned them down.
So why did you choose, like you've written history books and journalism, why did you choose this genre, I guess you could say, the thriller, the Cold War thriller kind
of? I don't know that I thought about it so much in that sense, but what I thought was this, that we accept so much of having learned about the Holocaust. What we don't seem to know much about was the resistance to the idea of the Holocaust, and that went on for a very long time.
That is in your book here. So yeah, talk a little bit about that. It really, in the 1950s, people didn't really...
Well, survivors didn't... So we were a more controlled society. So people didn't talk about a lot of things in public. You didn't hear the word cancer much in public either.
That's true.
But I think more than that, it helps people who have had these kinds of traumas to simply box it up and put it away. And nobody wanted to ask about it. I think people, in some regard, knew what happened, but they didn't want to know what happened. And as one character will say later in the book, not only are the victims frightening, look at the destruction, but the perpetrators are frightening too, because you have to ask yourself, well, they don't look any different than I do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So one of the main characters, Emma, she doesn't talk about, she runs a candy store, which her grandson, well, she gets murdered. I'm not giving anything away by saying that, but she doesn't talk about, he discovers things all along the way that he never knew about her, that he lived with her his whole life. She never even...
Well, two things. One, any sort of question, she sort of parried. But even then, he admits that he wasn't all that interested.
Yeah.
In other words, he was going down the shore, and there were girls and rock and roll, and this world seemed so far away. And the world of the mid-1960s here, compared to what was going on in the Soviet Union, I mean, they still hadn't recovered from the war. I maintain they still carry a lot of the war with them, which explains some of the behavior of Putin. But that's another story.
So how did you come up with this idea, the germination of the story of Emma and Michael and him sort of coming of age? He goes to Europe, he goes to Russia, and he ends up finding,
Well, I've always been rather tickled by the fact that the CIA helped fund rock and roll music. I don't know, that might just be me, but that seemed rather funny to me. On the other hand, it made perfect sense given what their goals were.
Well, you should tell people, in the book, there's a thing, it's sort of based on Voice of America, Radio Free Europe.
Right, it's based on
plays a part in this.
Right, and they broadcast rock and roll into the Soviet Union. Then I learned that Soviet baby boomers were busy counterfeiting and recording records. We're listening to rock and roll. We're seeing all kinds of movies that their people our age saw here. That many of them were enthralled with Western culture.
So
blue jeans were Levi's, which could get you thrown in prison, were extremely popular. I think they sold for 200 rubles a month, which was the average monthly salary for a worker.
So they made, I think in the book, I guess it's based on true, you do a lot of research, making the records out of an old X-ray.
Right, they didn't have vinyl, so they used X-ray, and they called it Rock on Bones.
So you just said a minute ago, the CIA, were they involved with like Radio Free Europe and those?
Radio Liberty, which had its own little corporate setup, was a CIA funded operation. Don't forget, and it's hard to know some of this stuff because the CIA has a black budget, and so you don't really know where the money's going. Also, as a corollary to the Marshall Plan, 10% of that money was kicked back in local currency.
Okay.
So you don't know where that money went. So it's very hard to know, but we were very much involved. Listen, the guys who formed the CIA were not liberal in the sense of the large L, but liberal in the sense of the small L. They've been widely educated at the finest prep schools in the country and the finest universities. And they understood that broadening people's minds often meant that they wanted freedom, and it was a great way to undermine totalitarian governments. So that's why they did it, and rock and roll was perfect. And Khrushchev hated rock and roll. I mean, the things that he said about, and the things that some of these Russians said about it, anti-Semitic and racist things that they would say about rock and roll, and the horrible things they said about women who danced. I mean, it was really, they called it pornography, and I mean, they were very upset about it. However, if you go on YouTube and you look at McCartney in Red Square, and watch the camera panning around to the crowd, many people who were young when the Beatles were the Beatles. And McCartney's on stage singing Back in the USSR. They're all singing right along with him in English. So I thought, this is really funny. We had to learn it somewhere, and they learned it listening to radio broadcasts.
And that comes through in the book. Your character, let me talk about some of your characters. Are any of them based on real?
I think, yeah, I think to some degree they are.
Like, how about this? There's a character called Der Schmuggler. Tell me about.
Yeah, well, he's based on a bunch of interviews that I did for Oh Powerful Western Star.
Okay.
And
he seems to work for everybody.
The amount of information, well, that part I changed for a reason, but there was a lot of smuggling in and out of the Soviet Union. It was a big place. It was 15% of the world's surface, so it's a large place. And to think that they had complete control of their borders is a little ridiculous. I mean, you got in a lot of trouble when they caught you, but a lot of people didn't get caught.
So a lot of the stuff in the book, like the X-rays, the Voice of America, you based.
I call it Four Freedoms Radio, but yeah.
But you based a lot of this on your research for all your journalism and history books.
Right, the hunting down of that Nazi war criminal in Amsterdam. One of the things that I learned as I started to research for this book, I didn't know this, was that in the early 60s, the West German Parliament wanted to pass a law that would exempt all West German citizens from being charged with war crimes between 1933 and 1945, which meant all those war crimes trials would have stopped because they were trying them under local statutes. They were trying them under murder, and if they gave them sort of immunity from that, those trials would have stopped. So,
well, that plays a very important part of the book, that West Germany wanted to roll back the statute of limitations on war criminals, and so that was a true.
Yeah, that's true.
So I'm starting to think that almost everything in this book is true, except for
there's a lot that's true. The part about the intelligence agencies that always interested me is that intelligence agencies sort of are the naked soul of a country, because they act, at least in the way they believe, in that nation's interest, sort of outside of morality, and they're amoral in that way. They're not necessarily immoral. I always say if they thought it was to the advantage of their country to save a bunch of people in a village, they would do that. If they thought it was to their advantage to blow up the village, they would do that. And so I was trying to get this aspect of the Cold War that was very bizarre, in that sometimes you'd see intelligence agencies actually have similar interests, and at times, of course, divergent interests. In the case of Nazi war criminals, the East Germans were much more anxious to try them. Of course, the Russians were happy to try anybody who had helped the Nazis because they had done such terrible things to their country. We were a lot more forgiving. We were more than willing to recruit them.
Well, actually, that was the other thing down here, which I did know was true, but another part of the book, which is very pivotal, besides the rollback of the statute of limitations on war criminals, was the U.S. helping ex-Nazis.
Absolutely.
I mean, not only helping them, setting them up.
We hired them. I mean,
we hired them. Yes, you're right.
Werner von Braun
was
an SS colonel who used slave labor to build those rockets. Those rockets were designed to be fired at civilian populations. Every one of those is a war crime. And the idea that he probably deserved to be in prison, if not hung.
Yeah.
Let alone what happened. Him and his 300 pals came here and helped develop our missile program.
Well, speaking of the morality or amorality, you have a character in here with the great name, head of the CIA, Taft Mifflin. Did I say that right?
Well, he's actually not head of the. Yes, you did. He's not.
Well, I'm not the head, but
yes,
he's a CIA
agent. He's actually in Wherever There Is Light.
Yeah,
he's a very
well.
minor
I noticed there was some people from your other book,
right,
back in West Orange,
right? Yeah.
But speaking of, he's not the head of CIA, but he's a CIA agent in this book that, to me, is like right out of a Graham Greene with the moral, amoral. What is he like based on anybody or?
For him, for me, he was based on this struggle that I think people have. We wouldn't be asking this question about should the CIA have hired these people.
Well, like I say, he exemplifies just what you were saying about.
Yeah, I think a lot of people went off to fight the Nazis because they deeply believed what they were doing was wrong. And after the war, they knew what they were doing was horrid. And yet, they wind up in this Cold War, which is a lot more ambiguous than stopping Hitler.
Yeah.
And he gets sucked into that operation that hires ex-Nazis and becomes sort of disgusted with what he's done. And he wants to do a decent thing before he ends his career. And then, of course, we meet his boss, who has a much different, the guy that we call the bookkeeper, who has a much different view of these things, of good and evil. And so I have that discussion. I mean, it's a discussion worth having because it's going on today.
Yeah. And now the other thing, like your other two books, I think I mentioned Come Back Love, your first novel, Wherever There Is Light, which you just mentioned. A few of the same characters are in there. You have this knack of creating very strong female characters. This book, is it Yulie? Am I saying that right? Yulie and Emma particularly. Does that just come natural to you, or you? I mean, what's?
Well, I mean, I had. Yeah, it does.
Okay.
I mean, I was thinking it comes, I had grandmothers that were formidable, and a mother who was, and a sister who is, so, and a wife who is.
Okay.
So, I also, but particularly with Yulie, I mean, there's a whole aspect to Yulie that most women don't face. Women helped the Soviet Union fight that war. At the Battle of Stalingrad, that's not in the book, so. The Battle of Stalingrad, women were, of course, like in our country, were working in the munitions factories. The difference is they were putting the finishing touches on the tanks and driving them right out of the factory into the battle. Some of their best snipers were women. Yeah. And if you remember, or if people remember, after the war, whenever they showed Russia, you saw these women doing all of these things that women didn't do here, in part because so many of their men were dead.
So another aspect of your book, just like the Wherever There Is Light, you have art. Art shows up. You have a cameo by Pablo Picasso, and you have a character. How do you say his name? Gak. Talk a little bit about the world, the art world, sort of.
Well, because Picasso. Well, the argument. I mean, intellectually, it fits in the story. Yeah. That's sort of. But intellectually, what I was after was the following. There's an argument they have, Picasso, Gak, and Chagall, they flash back to that, which Chagall is painting his Bible stories, which Gak thinks is absurd. This is, of course, during Hitler's rise to power. And it's sort of this argument about sentiment versus what was actually going on at the time. And of course, Picasso not only paints Guernica, but he then goes and he does Auschwitz, and he does a painting about after the war. And so his sort of vision, I was after, how did the art world see all this? And he was the best because he lived across all of it. He lived through the First World War. He lived through the Second. He lived through the Holocaust. And so I wanted his perspective, and also I wanted to go to the south of France because I thought that was that's not a place that's explored all that much regarding the Holocaust. Most people deal with Paris if they go to France. The south of France was
Well, there's a great little scene in there where he comes over and he talks to the main character and he draws him. And
Well, that's true. A very, very funny story about that. Yes, there's a scene where Picasso, I can say it, where the main character he likes to sketch, and he's sketching Picasso in a cafe, and Picasso comes over, sees what he's doing, and then draws him and Yuli. And when I sent that, and someone read it at Atria Simon & Schuster, they said, this is ridiculous. He goes, this isn't going to fly. So I said, it's taken from a newspaper article in the New York Times in 1965. I said, so I'm leaving it in. I said, it's going to be in the source book. It's going to be in the source notes. But I read about it. There was a guy who every day went to paint Picasso in a cafe. Picasso, after sitting there for a few days, got up, went over, looked at it, then sat down and painted the guy. But he had done that.
Yeah.
He had done that lots of times. Somebody went to talk to him once. Picasso walked outside, painted his car, and then signed his name on it.
Okay. Well, these are the kind of things when you get a historian writing fiction, you can come up with.
He was a pretty funny guy about things like that. And that thing about saving Salvador Dali's checks,
Yeah.
so that was true.
Yeah,
He did that too.
One of the biggest things in your book, themes, I guess you could say, is this concept of the past. Of course, the Holocaust. You were saying just a minute ago wasn't in the news as much in the 50s, but some people want to forget the past. Some people never want to forget. Tell me how you view why this plays such a big role in the.
I think the observation is true that if you don't see yourself on a historical continuum, then you're forever a child.
And in the book, like I say, in America, I think there was a quote, America sort of, doesn't really worry about the past.
Well, I mean, that's both a strength and a weakness.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons we're so innovative is like we look at what has happened in the past, say, well, forget that, we'll just do something new. However, you forget those things at your peril. I mean, it's been particularly difficult having lived through the Cold War to see these things come up again. I mean, I heard someone on the news the other day talking about regime change in Moscow. And I was thinking, we didn't do such a great job with that regime change in Baghdad.
Oh, yeah.
But the whole thing is so bizarre, and you see a lot of this. If in the news, you see a lot of it online, you'd think that there's no such thing as history. Well, history can be helpful. You don't want to reinvent the wheel.
Well, I mean, just 2 weeks ago, it was in the news when I went home for lunch today, Russia poisoning the guy. I mean, that's
right.
They've been doing that
a very long time. They did it in Munich. That was true. The thing about Munich, where they poisoned those people who were working at Radio Liberty, that's true.
Oh, okay. I don't think I got to that part yet. Is that?
Yeah. No. You read it. It's a part where it doesn't happen. Sort of. Taft tells him about it, about why there's a guard.
Oh, okay. So do you like combining this history and fiction? It seems to be your other books.
I think it's actually a way many people learn history now.
Yeah, it's I guess that's true. So you're going on a big book tour.
Yes.
You're going to be not just around our area. You're going all over the East Coast.
I'm going to. Let's see. I'm going to Florida. I'm going to Alabama.
And you're speaking in many synagogues.
I'm speaking in synagogues.
Okay. And if you go to, it'll be on the screen, petergolden.com. You got all kinds of information about you and your other books. So I think this book, like I say, is really good. You were to tell me before we started, you're expecting some big things.
I think people are interested in
Yeah.
it. I think people are. I think the Holocaust, if you have something to say about it, people don't know. They're anxious to read about it because it's been looked at quite a bit. So,
but you are taking a different sort of look at it, and you're telling me your next book you're planning was about women in.
I'm looking at Sachsenhausen, which is a camp that they used for women.
Okay.
I'm very curious about what went on there. There's some really interesting stories about Sachsenhausen. So I don't know. I'm going this summer. I'm going to go to Prague, and I'll be in Vienna.
Is that going to be is it going to be a novel, a fiction format?
Yeah, I think so. Right. I mean, that's what I'm thinking about now. but we'll see. I
Are you
don't-
going to be using South Orange again? I noticed like this begins.
people ask me
you got
about
a
that.
few of the same characters.
You know, people ask me why I do that. I did a newspaper interview, and the reporter asked me that, and I thought about it, and I said, because for me, that's ground zero in the Cold War. That's how the Cold War played out. It played out with kids in first grade sitting in a hall, putting their heads down. It played out with the paranoia that followed the assassination of President Kennedy when people thought the Russians had done this. It played out in the Cuban Missile Crisis prior to that. It played out in it was sort of this mix of Little League and disaster. And so I think the only way really for people to understand history in the way I'm looking to teach it is at a visceral level. I mean, I've read, when I've written more formal histories, I've read theoreticians of the Cold War. I mean, I know an awful lot about the high end of the Cold War, what was going on in Moscow, what was going on in Washington. But in the long run, I think how people felt about the Cold War and how it impacted people is better at that level. And I also thought I could take a small town in New Jersey and I could take a small town in Russia, and I could show you the difference.
Well, it is a good way to learn about history. I think, you can learn a lot about the Civil War from reading The Red Badge of Courage, which was a novel. Right. And Stephen Crane didn't even serve, I think. Right. And that's how we do things. So thank you, Peter. Good luck on your book tour.
Thank you for having me.
And the book, Nothing is Forgotten. We have many copies here in the library. Well, it's coming out April 9th. By the time you see this, we got 3 copies. His other books, too, Come Back Love, Wherever There Is Light, they're all here at the library, or Peter probably wouldn't mind if you bought some. So you'd probably see him at a book signing close by. So we'll see you next time on Meet the Author.